It's my huge pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Natasha de Vere, who's an associate professor and curator of botany at the Natural History Museum in Copenhagen. She comes from, originally, she's only been there a little while. She was previously at the National Botanical Garden in Wales. But Natasha has been a great stalwart fellow of the Linnean Society, and has been a member of council for the last 3 years, and is one of those people who is that a person like me as president totally depends on. And I just want to thank her in public, in person, for all the really hard work she's put in over the last 3 years. But what I'm really excited to hear about is her research about how to be bee friendly and the best plants for bees and other pollinators. And I think we'll learn a lot about bees today, but we'll also learn a lot about plants. And you can't think of those two things, one without the other. So Natasha, over to you, and thank you so much for coming along and speaking to us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sandy, for your introduction. So let's get started for World Bee Day, talking about bees and a few other pollinators as well, and of course the plants. So pollinators are vital, we know that, and they are facing increasing threats within the environment. And that is due to a combination of different reasons: pests and diseases, loss of habitat, climate change, insecticides, and agricultural intensification are causing a decline in wild pollinators and ill health in honeybees. And these factors are all interacting together to create a perfect storm of problems. And we know that the loss of flower-rich habitat for foraging is a key factor in pollinator decline and ill health in honeybees. So if we can understand plant use in wild pollinators and manage pollinators like honeybees, it can help us to provide what they need in order to survive. But how do we identify what plants are important for bees and other pollinators? And it's actually slightly harder than you might imagine. Of course, we can look at them. So we can look at plants and we can see what pollinators visit which plants. But there are limitations to this approach. We can only see that moment in time, that single interaction of what a pollinator lands on that plant at that moment. It would be really nice to be able to say, well, what was that pollinator, what was that insect doing before and after that moment? It's also difficult to see what they're doing when they're up in the trees or in their environments where it's difficult for us to get to and carry out our observations. So the work that I've been doing with my research group is looking at an alternative method for looking at what plants pollinators visit. And we look at pollen as a marker. So as soon as a pollinator visits a plant, it gets pollen on its body from that visit. Also, if you look at honey samples that honeybees have created, there is pollen within those samples. And we can use that as a record of what plants that they've been to see. Now, we can identify that pollen even by looking at it down a microscope, and that's the traditional approach. But actually, you need a high level of expertise to do that, and it takes quite a long time. So the approach that we use is we look at the DNA within the pollen itself. And we use a technique called DNA metabarcoding. So we can get pollen from the bodies of insects, from pollen loads or from honey, and find out what pollinators are getting up to. So this is a kind of overview of the molecular work that we do, and it's going to be the same method that we're using through all of the examples I'm going to give you within this talk. So first of all, we collect some pollen from the bodies of insects or from honey. We extract the DNA from that, and then we just amplify up. So we increase the DNA of 2 short sections of DNA, which are plant DNA barcode markers. They're called RBCL and ITS2. That doesn't matter too much, but it's just short sections of DNA that enable us to identify those particular plants. We then sequence that DNA so we can see what it is. And what we end up with is hundreds and hundreds of thousands of loads of little bits of DNA, and we want to know what plants they belong to. So the ability to do this technique is dependent on how good a reference library you have to be able to compare your samples to, your DNA that you've got to. So within the UK, I led the project that DNA barcoded all of the native flowering plants of the UK. So we had a big reference library of what those plants are, so we can then compare our DNA sequences to and find out exactly what plants the pollinators are visiting. And so what do we do with that? So the project that I want to tell you about and give you some examples of the work that we did this lunchtime is called Saving Pollinators. And it was all about understanding plant use by different pollinator groups. And the core of this research was carried out by, at the time, 3 PhD students. They now all have their PhDs. So the work here was carried out by Dr. Laura Jones, Dr. Abigail Lowe, and Dr. Lucy Witter. And the types of things we looked at. We started off with honeybees because they're important pollinators, but they're also very amenable to this research because we could take honey samples and find out what they've been doing. So we had a look at our honeybees and we wanted to say, sorts of questions we were asking is how specialized is the diet of honeybees? How does plant use change through the year? Can we detect periods of resource limitation? Do honeybees prefer native or non-native plants? What types of plants do they like? Is it trees, shrubs, or herbs? Has there been any historical changes in the honeybees' diet? We then wanted to broaden this out a little bit and look at other groups. So we looked at all of the different bees. We looked at bumblebees, honeybees, solitary bees, and then we also looked at hoverflies as well. And we had a look, do they use the same floral resources or do they prefer native or non-native plants? We're also interested in the societal impact of what can we do to help pollinators. So we carried out a big public engagement and training program. We also carried out a program on ethical beekeeping. We developed our own seed mixes and we developed a Saving Pollinators assurance scheme. So let's have a look at, let's just turn this off. So let's have a look at what we did with honeybees, first of all. And the study system for a lot of these examples I'm going to give you is the same. So if you have a look at this map in the centre of your screen here, this is the National Botanic Garden of Wales and Wynlass National Nature Reserve. So the areas are in yellow are horticultural areas, they're rich planted areas. And then in green, we've got areas of grassland. In brown, we've got areas of woodland in pale brown, and then in dark brown, we've got woodlands and linear features. And at the top, that big blob is the National Botanic Garden, and below that is our nature reserve managed as an organic farm. And this sea of white around it is actually a really rural agricultural area. So the Botanic Garden and Nature Reserve are surrounded by agricultural farmland, which is mostly used for cattle grazing. And within this environment, we had apiaries located within the Botanic Garden and within the Nature Reserve, and we had 6 hives located across those. We compared if there was a difference between these sites, but they were exactly the same, so the data's combined for those different areas. And so for our 6 hives, each month from April to September over a number of years, we took samples of honey and then we DNA barcoded that to find out what plants the honeybees were using. We then did floral surveys. We wanted to know how does that compare to what plants were available in the whole of the landscape. So we had a fabulous team of citizen scientists who every single month, they went out over the whole of the Botanic Garden and Nature Reserve, and they recorded all of the plants in flower. And so the types of results that we see, so honeybees use a range of different plants throughout the season, but some of the most important ones of those are shown on this chart on the right-hand side. So in red, we have by far the most important plant used by honeybees from April to September over a couple of years, and that is Rubus fruticosus or bramble. And this is incredibly important through many of the months of the year. We also have in a purple colour Trifolium repens, which is white clover, which is also really important. At the beginning of the season, there are flowering trees like apple and Cotoneaster, and also prunus, which is the flowering cherries. And towards a little earlier in the season, there's also willows and salix. Towards the end of the season, ivy is really important. But how does that relate to the amount of different plants within the landscape that the honeybees could be using? Well, actually, they only use a very small proportion of the plants available within the landscape. So they use quite a fair number of plants, but they only use a small number of plants abundantly. And of those, there's many, many more plants that they're not using. So on this table here, we go through the different months over a couple of years. We have the number of genera in flower as the first line, and then the number of genera found in honey, and then the proportion of those genera of plants which were used by honeybees. And you can see this ranges from 6 to 22, but it's quite low. So they're not using all of the plants within the landscape. And what's we can delve into in a little bit more detail is, well, what types of plants are they using? Are they using native plants or horticultural plants? Is it trees or shrubs or herbs that they're using? So in these two graphs here, if we start on the left-hand side, on each of these columns, we're going through the different months from April to September over a couple of years. And on the right-hand side, we've got the results of our floral surveys of all of the plants in flower in our landscape. And the proportion of different plants in flower is what is shown on the bars. So green are native and closely related to native plants. And the little strip of orange is naturalized plants. So these are ones which are found abundantly in the landscape, but aren't native plants. And then in yellow is our garden plants, our horticultural plants. And on the left-hand side, we've got the proportion of those plants that were found within the honey. So this is the proportion of the plants the honeybees were using. And actually what we see is over all the years and all of the months, the honeybees always use more native and near native plants than they do horticultural plants. That doesn't mean the horticultural plants aren't important. They probably increase the desire and the diversity of the diet of the honeybees. They're valuable for increasing the breadth of the diet, but the plants which the honeybees are mostly using are native or closely related to native plants. So then we can then look, okay, do they like trees or herbs or shrubs, and how does that vary? So again, on the right-hand side, we have the floral surveys, which show the proportion of plants in the landscape. And then on the left-hand side, we have the proportion within the DNA. And we see a lovely relationship that in the spring, there is a lot more trees being used by the honeybees than their availability in the landscape would suggest. So they seem to be really focusing on spring flowering trees. By the time we get to the summer, they're using shrubs a lot more than we might think. And that's nearly all because of Rubus fruticosus, this one plant. And then as we go through the summer, they start to use slightly more herbs within the landscape. And using the DNA technique, we can really delve into exactly what each colony of honeybees is doing within the landscape. So on these charts here, this is months, this is 2019, and we've got April, May, June, July, and August. And the H1 to 6 is each of the individual colonies, hives of honeybees, and what they're doing. And the right-hand side is the plants that they were using, and the proportion is the width of those little ribbons. And so in April, we see that the honeybees are using flowering cherries, which is prunus. They're using salix, which is willow, and they start to use acer, which is sycamore. By the time we get to May, they're using a lot of acer. They're still using some of the prunus and the salix. But by June, it all goes a little bit haywire. In the previous months, all of the hives, all 6 hives, were using all of the same resources, more or less. When we get to June, the spring flowering trees have all finished flowering, and suddenly we think there's not enough food available. And so all of the different hives of bees, they're all doing something different, and they're all using smaller amounts of whatever they can get in terms of plant availability. By the end of June, the rubus fruticosus, the blackberries, the bramble, it starts to flower. And suddenly we see a shift. The honeybees start to find the bramble, and then they use that almost exclusively for July and August. They have this shift in their diet. The other plant they use a lot of is white clover, which is Trifolium repens. So we start to get this picture that honeybees aren't super generalists, just using whatever is available in the landscape, that it's much more focused in that. There's a small number of plants that they really like to use abundantly within the environment. But this was just looking within our botanic garden in Wales. How similar was that to other areas of the UK? And also, did that change much over time? Is this something that's fixed in terms of the plants that the honeybees use? So we then had a look at historical changes in honeybee flora across the whole of the UK. So we asked beekeepers to send us samples of honey, and we DNA barcoded those honey samples to find out what plants were being used. So this was carried out in 2017. We then compared that to a study from 1952. And in 1952, a scientist called A.S.E. Deans conducted a similar survey of even more, 885 honey samples. This time they were looking at the pollen using microscopy. And we spent a bit of time calibrating those results so we could compare 1952 with 2017. And these are the results that we find. So we found more plants in 2017 being used because of the changes in our technique, but we find 47 different types of plants which are found across both studies. And there's a close correlation between the amount of those plants which are being used by the honeybees. These charts here on the left-hand side, they show 1952 and 2017, and they basically show the frequency of these plants being found within the different honey samples, and the colours represent the abundance. So red is a plant which is being used a lot, and then orange is being used a little bit less. So we've got an idea of what plants are being used previously, and there's some similarity. And there are 4 plants which are really, really important for the honeybees. But actually, the proportion of those plants in the landscape has changed significantly between 1952 and 2017. So in 1952, by far the most important plant for honeybees was Trifolium repens, white clover. It was a really important plant within the landscape. By 2017, Trifolium repens is still important, but by far the most important plant now is Rubus fruticosus. And we think what's happened is changes in agricultural practice have led to these changes that we see in the plants that the honeybees are using. So Trifolium repens, white clover, used to be a major plant of agricultural grasslands. It was a major source of protein for cattle and sheep foraging. And what happened is, as agricultural intensification continued, more silage production, the increased use of agricultural inorganic fertilizers and pesticides means that grass layers with lots of clover in have decreased in the landscape. This means there's a lot less white clover, and we think the honeybees swapped into using more bramble, Rubus fruticosus, instead. The honeybees also track other changes that have happened in the landscape within the UK since 1952. So there's been a significant increase in the amount of oilseed rape, Brassica napus. Now, as a crop at this point in the UK and here in Denmark as well, we see fields coated in fields of yellow oilseed rape. But it's actually quite new that this has been used as a crop plant. It started to be really grown abundantly from around the 1970s. By the 1980s, it was used at really high levels, similar to today. And what we find is the honeybees have tracked that. So as it started to be grown more and more, the honeybees started to use it more and more within the landscape. So Brassica napus has increased. There are problems with this. Brassica napus, if it's treated with neonic insecticides, means that the honeybees can be visiting it along with other pollinators, but it can be causing them problems. And then finally, the honeybees tracked Himalayan balsam, Impatiens glandulifera, and this is an invasive species. So this is a problem for the honeybees. This is a problem in terms of the wider environment because Himalayan balsam as an invasive species can coat the edges of rivers and cause huge problems in terms of outcompeting native plants and clogging waterways. But it grows really late in the season, and honeybees and other pollinators actually totally adore this plant. They think it is a fabulous plant. It produces lots of nectar late in the season. And so as its invasiveness increased within the landscape in the UK, the honeybees used it more and more. So that's our honeybees. And so we can see what plants our honeybees have used. And what we can conclude from this is, first of all, that honeybees use, although they use a number of plants, they only use a small number of plants really abundantly within the environment. We also see that they prefer native or closely related to native plants, but horticultural plants might extend the diet and the season for the honeybees. We see that there might be a resource limitation gap in June. Beekeepers often know about this. They call it the June gap. It's a period where honeybees have less food available to them. And this is also shown in other pollinator groups as well. And we've shown historical changes of honeybees slightly changing their diet depending on what's really abundantly available within the landscape. But how does that compare to what other pollinators are doing? So we also wanted to look at plant-pollinator interactions with bumblebees, honeybees, and solitary bees, so all of the different bee groups. And we also had a look at what hoverflies were doing. Now, our study system for these next examples I'm going to give you is the same as for the honeybees. It's in the National Botanic Garden of Wales. But this time, within the environment, there's a series of black dots here. And these black dots represent transects. So these were transects which were walked once each month for a number of years from March to September. The pollinators visiting plants were collected and the pollen was removed from their body, and we DNA barcoded that pollen to see what plants they were visiting. And on this big crazy chart that you can see in the middle, this just gives you an idea of the complexity of the relationships that we can see. So this is all of the bees and hoverflies that we collected over a couple of years, over all of those months. And so all of the insects are shown on the left-hand side and all of the plants are shown on the right-hand side. And what we see is that although there's lots of interactions here, there's a few really important plants which are important across the board for bees and hoverflies. No surprises. Rubus fruticosus, which is bramble, is still really, really important. Also important in yellow is buttercups. This is ranunculus. We also have in blue, this is the thistles. So this is Cirsium, but also things like Centaurea, which are really important pollinator plants. We also have in green, these are members of the Apiaceae or the carrot family. So these are things like Angelica and also hogweed. And if you sort of look at those results just in terms of the most abundant plants, you can see that these are the ones coming up here. So we have the thistles, we have the bramble, which is Rubus fruticosus, and we have the Apiaceae. Do they prefer native or non-native plants? Again, we definitely see that the bees and hoverflies are using more native and closely related to native plants within the landscape. However, what we see is that that changes throughout the season. So by the time we get to the autumn, horticultural plants are being used a little bit more in the environment compared to what they were being used early in the season. So we think the horticultural plants might extend the season a little bit. Then how do we compare bees with hoverflies? So on these charts here, if we start on the far left-hand side, the colours of these bars represent different plants, but the only thing that we want to have a look at here is just the proportion of those bars and the different range of colours, because we're just using that to have a bit of a comparison about what bees and hoverflies do. So on the far left-hand side here, we've got Diptera, which is hoverflies, and we compare that to Hymenoptera, which is bees. And this is the proportion of the different types of plants that they use. And what you can see is these bars are very different. There's different colours going on here. And this is caused by the Diptera, the hoverflies using more Apiaceae, so the carrot family, and the bees are using a little bit more of the thistles. We can also, if you look at bee, the bee figure here, this is looking at the different bumblebees and honeybees and the solitary bees. And you can see that they're also using quite different types of plants as well. We can compare within the bumblebees, those with short tongues and long tongues, and we find that they are also differing from each other, with the short-tongued bumblebees being a little bit more like the honeybees. But what's really interesting is we can even delve down into, say, for example, the hoverflies, and we can have a look at the different plants that the hoverflies use, depending on what the larval food plant of those hoverflies are. Because hoverflies are pretty impressive creatures, and their larvae do all kinds of different things. Some of them are predators, some of them eat vegetation, some of the larvae are found in water. So you have this huge diversity of different larval types with hoverflies, but the adults are all foraging on flowers. They're sometimes called the flower flies. And we see that depending on the larval food type, there's a real difference in what the adult hoverflies are doing. So we're really starting to delve down and see that when we say, well, what are good plants for pollinators? Well, what do we mean by that? What do we mean by a pollinator? And how does that relate to what plants we should have available within our gardens or within our landscapes? We also took a look at seed mixes, and we developed our own seed mixes. We also looked at different commercial seed mixes. So these are annual plants which are grown specifically often for their amenity value, big splashes of colour that you see on the edges of motorways or in amenity areas or in people's gardens. But they're also often considered to be good for pollinators. So we had a look at those and said, well, how good are they for different pollinator groups? And what we found is that the seed mixes differ in terms of how good they are, and that they vary in terms of what plants bumblebees and hoverflies are using. We can also do some really cool stuff with the DNA barcoding, because we can take an individual bumblebee or hoverfly, and from that we can say, okay, how much pollen is on this insect from inside the seed mix, and how much has come from outside of the seed mix. And that means we can track how the use of the seed mix relates to what's going on outside of the plots as well. And on these charts here, we have bumblebees on the left and hoverflies on the right, and the plants they're using inside the seed mixes compared to outside. A nice example with the bumblebees is in June. They're using lots of Rubus fruticosus, the bramble. As that starts to finish flowering, they start to use a lot of the thistles and similar species from within the plots. So they're basically shifting from brambles, and they're starting to use the seed mix, particularly towards the end of the season. And this is basically that information illustrated in a different format. And so on the chart on the left-hand side here, this is basically a plot which is showing all of the different insects and how it relates to the plants they're using. And in red are bumblebees and in blue are hoverflies. And you can see that these are really different kind of blobs of data. And that's because the bumblebees and hoverflies are using really quite different plants within the landscape. On the right-hand side, the colour which ranges through from red in June until sort of a purple colour in October. This is showing that the hoverflies and the bumblebees use different plants throughout the season. So we have lots of information there. We've got lots of information about the different plants which are important. We know that different plants are important as we go through the season and throughout the year. We also know that native plants or closely related are really quite important. So let's bring all that together and make some recommendations on plants for pollinators. And this is a little bit more focused towards gardens and amenity areas. So, based on our results, first of all, bees and hoverflies visit a different range of flowering plants. So if you go to the garden centre and it says, this is perfect for pollinators, well, we want to know, well, which pollinators is that important for? Is it important for bees, or is it important for hoverflies? And we're only looking at bees and hoverflies. Is it important for butterflies or for moths? We also know that different plants are used through the season. So it's really important to provide plants for pollinators throughout the whole year. The spring is really important for pollinators to build up resources. And at the end of the season, they need to be able to keep going. If it's a honeybee or for bumblebees, they need to be able to build up resource for winter. We've also shown that there's a gap in June after the spring flowering trees have finished flowering. And so we need to look at this as a period where we should be providing more plants for pollinators. We see this within gardens, that there's a resource gap in June, but some of our collaborators have also looked at farmland and again shown that there's this gap when the spring flowering trees have finished flowering before the rubus and some of the other plants start to come into bloom. So we have a gap that we need to look what we do with. We see that bees and hoverflies use more native and near native plants. So it's important that we incorporate these within our gardens. We can either plant plants which are native or closely related to native plants, or we can give space to those which grow within our gardens without us having to do anything at all. So let's let our dandelions bloom within our gardens and our lawns. We also clearly need to protect woodlands and hedgerows and the native habitats, which are really important for these pollinator groups. I probably wouldn't recommend that everyone lets Rubus fruticosus brambles take over their entire garden, but it's a really important plant. We need to make space for it within our landscapes. In particular, we often see in farmland that we'll have a hedgerow, and then we have often a little bramble margin, a little Rubus fruticosus margin. That's really important for both pollinators, but also dormice and other animals as well. And so Rubus is a real keystone species within our landscapes. We can't think about just the plants in isolation without thinking about how those plants are grown. So if the plants are grown with systemic insecticides, or if we use pesticides and insecticides in our gardens, we're going to be harming those pollinators that we want to attract. So we want to look about how our plants have been grown and make sure we're not using pesticides in our own gardens. We also need to look at the growing medium. If plants are grown in peat, we're destroying an incredibly important habitat for both carbon sequestration, but also for pollinator habitat as well. So as part of our bigger project, we developed a Saving Pollinators Assurance Scheme where we worked with nurseries that grew plants that we knew were good for pollinators based on our research, but were grown without the use of peat and pesticides. And just to finish, I want to give you some of my personal recommendations. This is a little bit of a random list, to be honest, because there are so many different plants that we could choose. There's a great range, but I wanted to just give you things which, you know, I would always want to have in any garden or green space that I have. Salix caprea, the goat willow, this is fantastic. It can grow anywhere. You don't have to have a big garden. You can grow it in a pot. Fairly big pot, but you can grow it in a pot, or you can use it as a, on a hedging plant. It is critically important early in the season for pollinators to bulk up. Flowering cherries are beautiful street trees. They're also beautiful and not too big garden trees as well. One that I like a lot are the single flowered varieties of Prunus yedoensis. They're beautiful to look at and the pollinators love them. Let your dandelions go free. Dandelions are another really important source early in the season. Really do make sure that they're available and just let them grow and have their lovely, happy flowery heads for pollinators to use. I've put a thistle here because thistles are really important. But when I talked about native or closely related to native plants, that means that there's often lots of really beautiful garden plants which are really good for pollinators. So this is Cirsium rivulari atropurpureum, and it is an absolutely beautiful garden plant. It's very, very easy to grow, and bumblebees and other bees really, really adore this particular plant. I have wild Angelica sylvestris, and this is a wild native plant to the UK, but it's also a really, really beautiful plant, which I think we should grow a lot more in wild areas of our gardens, particularly on the maybe darker, slightly damper spots. And Angelica sylvestris is really, really popular for the hoverflies. Trifolium repens or Trifolium pratense, which are the clovers. It is really, really easy to naturalize these into lawns or to create a lawn area just with clover, particularly with white clover, and it's a great source of pollinators. Towards the end of the season, ivy, heterohelix, is a really vital end of season plant for nectar and pollen for many of both hoverflies and bees. And so allowing that to grow within our landscapes, allowing that to flower around trees, making sure we don't cut it is really, really important to create that last end of season resource. So that's it from me. Sorry, there's been possibly some cutouts where my internet has been playing up, but hopefully you've got the gist of some of the things that we're talking about there. And I'm going to leave this slide up so you can see some of the favorite recommendations of plants. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Natasha. That was absolutely fascinating. And it's really a great overview and blended all kinds of cutting edge science with things that we as individuals can do to make a difference. We have a few questions. We don't have a lot of time for questions, but we have a few. And this is something I was wondering as well, is in the very beginning, when you were talking about the honey, meta-barcoding the honey, how did you know that the honey was recently done honey? How did you assess that? How did you figure that out?
Yeah, it's so what we did was we would go to the hive. We're monitoring these hives on a weekly basis, so we kind of know what the honeybees are doing, and you can see within the super where new nectar has been put into the hive, into the super, and where that's just been capped, so a layer of wax has been put over the top, and that's the most kind of newly put down honey. But Honeybees can be a little bit tricky. They do also move honey around in the hive as well. But we found that the phenology, let's get back. We found that the phenology of the plants related quite nicely. So we found that this newly capped honey was working pretty well.
Yeah, that's a great way of that's a great way to kind of to show that it's really new. Someone has asked, does shop bought compost make a difference? And I think what they mean is the last thing you were talking about, peat. And I think probably the answer to that is it doesn't make a difference to the plants necessarily, but it actually makes a huge difference to the planet. So one should always buy peat-free compost. And there is lots of peat-free compost out there now.
Absolutely. Demand, get peat, always buy peat-free compost, things which say reduced peat or sustainable peat. They're just not, just use peat-free compost or make your own compost. I'm actually, I don't do a lot of that myself. I just buy peat-free compost. There's lots of availability now, much more than there ever used to be.
Yeah, it's true. You really can find, you can even find it in my corner shop at the minute. Someone's also asked is, why do you think rubus is so strongly favored by bees? You always hear that diversity is important, but this dependence of bees upon rubus sounds like they're after something really quite specific. Is it just a glucose fructose balance, or what is it about rubus that makes it so enticing?
Yeah, I mean, partly it might just be that it flowers for a long time. And what's really interesting about rubus is a microspecies group. It's apomictic. It doesn't actually need to be pollinated. So this is the really kind of weird thing about it. But that, because it's a group of lots of little closely related species, it has a long flowering season, and it's also very abundant. It has lots of rich nectar and pollen. It's probably not richer than some of the other things. So it's possibly just availability, but it's something that we're interested in looking at in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, and everyone's always trying to get rid of brambles. So I think the kind of not get rid of brambles movement needs to start. Yeah. Someone has asked so someone has said, I'd like to know how you deal with plant identification and pollen meta-barcoding. Do we need to build a local plant barcode database first?
Yes, and that's really, really important. So that's why this study has worked quite well in the UK, because we DNA barcoded all of the native plants, and then we combined in the horticultural plants as well. So you have to have that kind of reference library to compare to in order to start the investigation and to really make the identifications work.
Yeah, Gail's asked, she has some lavender in her garden, and the bees seem to go wild for it, and she's surprised that it isn't one of the kind of the big four. So is it not that important, or is it just where where you were doing your work?
Yeah, this is an important point, that all of the results that I've presented here are the absolute top hitters in terms of the plants that the pollinators are using. We're not saying that other plants are not important as well. So there are many, many pollinator plants that they're also using in smaller amounts. They're just not using them on the big kind of scale that we're seeing with things like rubus or clover. Lavender is really important. The geraniums are really, really important. And actually having that diversity is important within gardens as well. So what we recommend is make sure we have our native habitats protected, that we're growing native plants, but do supplement that with horticultural plants, particularly towards the end of the season and at the beginning of the season and in that June gap.
Yeah, there's a person who said that some of these kind of sage and rosemary and things are quite popular as well, and those are often very late blooming, which is one of those things. Someone has asked, David Pearson's asked about raspberries. So how about raspberries? They kind of same as brambles, no?
Pretty much, yeah. So raspberries are also great, and actually, in some countries in Europe, you can buy raspberry honey, and it's beautiful. It tastes really lovely. So it's also very popular. We don't grow it quite so much in the UK, but it's definitely a nice kind of alternative. They don't seem to use it quite so much, but it's still a really, really useful plant.
There's a question also here is about the questioner said, as a botanist who's written a flora, are there any plans to write a flora signifying usefulness of plants to pollinators?
Yes, definitely. So it's something that we're looking at doing. So it's on my list of books to write, along with, best tips for gardening for pollinators.
It might be a really good thing to do on the web, for example, Natasha, is to take a flora that's already there and then just add a field, which is about the usefulness of plants to pollinators. It'd be, one, a lot less work, and two, possibly a bit more accessible, which might be really great.
Yeah, I think it might make it happen a bit quicker as well.
Well, I know it's so hard. It can be so hard. And someone else has asked, do you prefer Japanese cherry versus native hawthorn? Which one of those is more preferred by bees?
Hawthorn is really interesting because, and this is well known in the beekeeping literature, that some years it's amazing. And you see it really abundantly within the honey samples, and you see it being used by pollinators. Other years, it just doesn't. And it seems really variable in terms of its use as a pollinator plant. So the flowering prunus is much more reliable, but the wild cherries as well as the cultivated varieties.
So is that because the hawthorn is very variable in its flowering abundance year to year, or is it just that bees change their behavior year to year?
I think it seems to be to do with the hawthorn itself. So, I mean, there was early studies in the 50s being conducted at Rothamsted Research, and they showed really interesting results, that there was like an interval of years and then hawthorn was really important again. It does seem to be something about how abundant the nectar is available for the hawthorn. It's also the time of year, which is quite stochastic as well. So if you have a period of poor weather, you can miss a whole plant because the bees just can't get out of the hive or the colony at the point where they would use that resource. So that's something we see at the beginning of the season as well.
Someone's asked another question, which is, and I'm not going to get to all these questions. There's so many questions. I'm never going to get to them all. So apologies if your question isn't answered. Is how far do bees travel? Could these bees have traveled outside of the study area that you were using? Although it's quite big, your study area is quite big.
Yes, absolutely. So we measured within the study area because we knew it was really diverse. We knew we had all the gardens and we had all of the plants which kind of represented the local area. It doesn't mean the bees weren't going out of that area to forage as well. We know they went out of the area to get Himalayan balsam because we didn't have that. Bees are recorded to easily travel. They can travel 10 kilometers if there's something they really like, but they won't if they don't have to. So they will travel further for a resource they want. They will fly over the whole of the horticultural area sometimes because there's a plant they want in the nature reserve. But typically they would prefer to go a shorter distance in terms of being energy efficient.
So, I'm going to ask my question because I've always wondered this, is how do they know that something is native?
They don't, and this is why it's like when we say native or near native plants, it seems to be that plants which are kind of closely related to the flora are used a bit more. But there's also the fact that they are also more abundant within the landscape. So there's kind of different things going on here. Yeah. And what we see with something like the Himalayan balsam, which is so with Himalayan balsam, which is a non-native plant that was brought in, it's not related to anything quite close to the UK flora. When that becomes really abundant, they shift to that. So it's not a kind of absolute rule. It's more of a, if you provide more native things in the landscape.
Yeah. So, here's an interesting idea: is do you have any plans to encourage honeybee keepers to plant more forage for their honeybees, so that wild honeybees, well, we don't have wild honeybees, bumblebees, solitary bees, and hoverflies are not deprived?
Yeah, I mean, definitely where we've got these key periods of point, for example, in June, where we've got a resource limitation, definitely then you could get more competition. So ethical beekeeping is, first of all, if you want to keep hives, you need to look at the forage in your area. Do you have enough forage for your bees and also for the wild pollinators as well. The scale that honeybees work at means that as an individual gardener or beekeeper, you can't really grow a kind of field of crops for the honeybees, but you can look at what's available and make sure that the number of beehives that you have is suitable, that you're also not siting those hives in, say, a nature reserve where you've got rare bees being found. So we can have coexistence between these things, but it's a balance, like so many things.
Like so much of us kind of engaging over the landscape. Someone's asked about studies about beetles as pollinators. Do you know any studies about beetles as pollinators?
Yeah, not so much. So, I mean, we're saying pollinators here, but of course, we're just looking at this little tiny proportion, even still, of just the bees and the hoverflies. There are the butterflies and moths, the beetles. There's been some great work done on moths, but there is a big field of research which is interesting to look at.
Okay, so there's another question about, and I'm just going to do a couple more. Are there particular things that support solitary and other wild bees rather than managed honeybees? I mean, and the APA, you kind of showed that in your graphs, didn't you?
Yeah. So the papers which are in the talk, all of those papers have got big lists of the plants in as well. So particularly the paper in Journal of Applied Ecology, which has just come out, which is led by Abigail Lowe. We've got a big list of suggested plants in there, and we divide that into honeybees, solitary bees, bumblebees, what's good for all of them, what's good for one particular group if you want to make sure you're targeting them.
Yeah, no, so I think that's the place to go, but also kind of stopping the YouTube and looking at those graphs. There's fantastic graphs, absolutely wonderful graphs, Natasha. They're absolutely great. And I think, you know, letting weeds grow is such an important thing. And it's wonderful to see No Mow May, where you get people with, you know, you get these lawns with dandelions in them and everything coming up. But I'm going to let you go now, Natasha, because you've been with us a while and you did a fantastic job. And that was such a good talk. And I love the recommendations at the end, because, you know, it's often true that in thinking about, you know, protecting our planet and protecting nature, it often seems like the little things that one person does can't make a difference. But there's, you know, 7 little tiny things that each of us can do, which will play a part towards actually protecting nature. And I think that's a fantastic message to end with. So thank you so much, Natasha, and I look forward to seeing you at the next council meeting. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
And thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you.